welcome everyone. This is our panel on feedback and complaints mechanisms and how they're useful and relevant for engaging with affected populations. And really also trying to focus on how we close the loop. So not just how we're listening, but how we're responding to feedback and what we do with that in the context of programming and strategies. My name is Dana Brown. I'm the director of the listening program at CDA. I also co-wrote the background paper for you and have engaged with some of you in a lot of our listening project and some of our work. We have 3 presentations today by 4 esteemed panelists. And also want to acknowledge a number of people in the room who I know do a lot of work on feedback mechanisms and complaints and response mechanisms, and who hopefully will also be adding some of their experience. I'll do just a really brief introduction. We will have a little bit, just questions for clarification after each presentation, and then we'll have more time for discussion and questions and answers following all 3 presentations. So without further ado, I'm going to want to welcome Luz Saavedra, who's the Humanitarian Planning and Monitoring, Evaluation, and Accountability and Learning Officer. That is a mouthful. MEAL, I think most of us know what MEAL means, and it doesn't mean, well, it's got a few meanings, right? But she works with Oxfam Intermon, and she's going to share some lessons from Niger, from some of their feedback mechanisms with us first. So I will...
Good morning, everyone. So this presentation, as you can see, is about the feedback and complaints, what is useful and relevant for the affected populations, and particularly focusing on the research that I did with the teams of Oxfam GB in Niger. I wanted to start by telling you a story. 3 years ago, I was in Ethiopia, in the Somali region, with the Intermon teams that were doing the assessments to open on the Horn, yet again, drought response. And it was a very long and interesting conversation with an old lady, one of the best key informants that we can have. I'm sure a lot of you have this experience. And to make the long story short, basically she said, listen, you seem like a nice person. I'm going to share with you something. You NGO people have to stop asking again and again the same questions, how many goats I have, this, that, the other. If you really want to reach the most vulnerable people, you have to ask whether you have cousins in Calgary that send remittances. That's really the criteria. So it's funny, but at the same time says a lot, in the sense of humanitarians, we can be very good at, well, we try to be very good at standardized and quick responses, but sometimes too standardized and not paying that much attention to the context. Yeah? So in the sense, this presentation, looking at the background paper, I would say that, of course, on one hand, there's the value perspective from linking with the humanitarian principles and starting by humanity. It's so obvious that sometimes we forget. But also from the what Arnab called instrumental, in the sense that I want to claim that feedback and complaint response mechanisms is part of the essential information that you have to be able to gather and analyze to say that your program is a quality humanitarian response. Briefly, why we did a research, an actual research on feedback and complaints mechanism. There's a double logic here. On one hand, Oxfam has minimum standards for emergencies that include accountability, and we have been rolling them out since Haiti 2010. And I have been lucky to be involved in many of the responses in the Horn, in Haiti, in Sahel, etc. So the teams were requesting, can you please provide us, beyond the theory, with practical and operational and programmatic tools that we can implement with regards to specifically the issue of feedback and complaints. So looking for the focus on the essential and the quality, the hypothesis that we wanted to test in Niger was what is really useful and relevant for affected population groups, taking into account this practical and operational approach of focusing on what we really need to know versus what would be nice to know, or maybe later on we can have time to check on. So from a methodological perspective, the initial phase was a literature review of Oxfam and humanitarian system documents, but I also participated in teleconference from Hub and exchanges with other colleagues from Save the Children and from World Vision, etc., etc. As Monica was saying yesterday, there's so much out there. In the sense of using Oxfam, those of you that were last year in the conference of ALNAP talking about evidence-based, probably some of you heard the presentation by Vivian Walden on the HIT, the Humanitarian Indicator Tool, that has 13 benchmarks, and one of those benchmarks is about feedback and complaints. So it was very interesting to take all the hits that we have done in Oxfam and compare what has been the learnings that we can extract to see if there were any trends. And I'm going to come back to that, and if I don't, please feel free to ask now or later. The literature review and the coming up with what is out there and learning was an essential part of the methodology and of the work, because we try to link what the system has learned with the impulse and the creativity and the innovation to try to figure out ourselves things that in fact have been discussed for decades now. The learning aspects from the experience of Niger, I want to tell you two things. On one hand, why we did qualitative and participatory methods, and on the other hand, why we choose Niger. Niger was a very special case. We choose it on purpose for many reasons, but basically two. It's a country where Oxfam and other organizations have been working quite a lot on documenting our experiences on feedback and complaints mechanisms. And as you know, one of the problems that we have with this area is traceability and documentation, and capturing informal knowledge, and capturing all the good work that gets done at field level, but does not necessarily reflect on the reports. So in that sense, for example, they have set up complaint committees, and there was an evaluation that was done in 2012. Just when we started, there was an extremely interesting workshop that Save the Children and Oxfam organized at Niamey level, where there were concern worldwide and plenty of national Nigerian NGOs that were sharing their experiences. And I think that humanitarians, we like to learn by doing, and we adore to have these spaces where we exchange. And the Niger case was special in this sense because there were traces of documentation, and traces of documentation on what are the preferences of the population, how we can see differences between Agadez and the south that is much more culture of aid, etc., etc. So why qualitative and participatory? We were not that much interested in coming up with something that was representative of the whole system, but we were interested in understanding better, and we were interested above everything to get different perspectives from different stakeholders, because we are perfectly aware of the fact that affected communities are not homogeneous, and you have many groups within, and the richness is something that we wanted to capture. Yeah. And a third phase would be to pilot all these learnings in an emergency setting. So in terms of the need to know quality, we have had very long discussions, for example, with our colleagues when we were in the Syria response, trying to figure out what in Syria is the minimum, bare minimum that you can ask in such difficult context. So here is the theory for you to destroy it if you want, and have a fruitful discussion about it. So in order to, the minimum, bare minimum that you need to have in order to assess the quality of a humanitarian response is related to two areas. Coverage, how many people we reach, then we can get more details, but how many people, we have to be able to say. And on the other hand, is the response relevant? Relevant with regards to two sections. On one hand, relevant against quality standards and technical standards that exist, and relevant in terms of people perceived needs and levels of satisfaction. Sub-criteria of that sometimes is put under effectiveness, would be timeliness. Timeliness not only in the rapidity of the response, but in being able to react and adapt to change in context and needs. So, from our perception, from the literature review and from the experience that we have, the humanitarian system in general and the donors in particular, they privilege very much so issues related to coverage and issues related to standards adherence in terms of relevance. And unfortunately, this gets done many times in detriment of the aspect that we can say that is linked to social accountability. In Oxfam, like in many other organizations, we use the 5 dimensions of social accountability by the definition of one world trust, etc. So we are talking about information sharing and transparency, so from us out, the participation aspect, and the feedback and complaints response mechanisms. And I'm going to read exactly the definition that we have in our minimum standards in Oxfam. Is Oxfam shall establish and implement feedback and complaint handling procedures that are effective, accessible, and safe for intended beneficiaries and communities, agency staff, project partners, and other specific bodies. So within this idea that the need to know essential is based on these 2 areas, our research action was particularly focusing on this neglected aspect of the relevance, that is, what is the perception and the level of satisfaction of beneficiaries in the specific dimension of feedback and complaint mechanisms. And it makes it longer, but I every time stress, and when we have discussions with the team, same, feedback and complaint mechanisms, okay? Because it's not only about complaints, it's also about listening. So what are the 5 key messages that we got from Niger? On one hand, we want to acknowledge that a lot of assumptions that are there, a lot of assumptions and specific pieces that are out there of what you have to do, how you have to do it, have been again validated by this research. And examples that I can give you is multiplicity of mechanisms is more effective than just a single one. Knowing the terms in local language and working with interpreters, and note that I say interpreters and not translators, because they are really interpreting the reality for us. And it's such a simple thing to ask what is the local term for this and that, and it makes such a difference. Understanding traditional systems, maintaining a balance between the standards and the context related, differentiating between types of complaints. So we made a broad differentiation between abuse of power related complaints, that because of their nature you're going to treat them in a different way, and what we call more programmatic or operational complaints. And within these programmatic or operational complaints, the comparative analysis of the HIT told us that there's such an important number of these complaints that is related to targeting that we are going to treat it separately. Exclusion errors in targeting it's a classic domain where we get complaints. That we managed to document too. So in terms of, I have like 2 minutes, I think. Let me go through the gist. So 2 key things to understand the basic dimensions. This is not a recipe or a checklist, but something that we have to go through in order to be useful and relevant for beneficiaries. The first one, and I'm pretty sure this is not flash news, aid is not at the center of the life of affected communities. There's much more. We have been talking about first respondents. We have been talking about mechanisms that exist within societies, families, individuals, communities, etc. And this also reminds us how important it is to be aware of our limitations and to have a humble attitude, and to be proactive in understanding better this. Yeah? In the same package, it's built on what already exists. And here I'm going to put 2 things that we all know. On one hand, traditional systems that exist, and one of the things that was more surprising is how much the religious dimension is neglected in the literature review and in the things that we have been checking with the teams. We talk about social, political, economic, anthropological, sociological perspective, and religious is very neglected many times. Nevertheless, it has a huge impact in the way that people perceive solidarity, in the way that people perceive how we help each other, and especially it had, and we can come back to this in the questions, it had an interesting point with regards to difference between female and men. Build on what already exists also in the humanitarian system. I think it has been said before, we don't have to add things. We already have data collection exercises. We already have household visits. So it's including the accountability aspect and creating these spaces where people can have the opportunity to provide us feedback. How we are going to do that? How we are going to tackle the work? Well, one essential thing is capturing formal or tacit knowledge, and that is very difficult indeed, but at the same time, we are responsible for that. We cannot give a cahier, like in Niger, we were giving a cahier for the complaints and doléances. You cannot expect people to fulfill your work. It's up to you to do the analysis, to be critical, to determine this is something I don't need to enter. They can manage themselves, bravo. Maybe you document how much complaints they have done by themselves. And it's up to you to have this level of analysis. And it's up to you to go to the field and talk to the people. Don't expect them to fill up your notebooks with complaints, because that's not going to work. It's our responsibility. And we are very much linked with this tacit knowledge. And a fifth one, and this is a tricky one with the increase of remote monitoring, etc., and access problems. Nothing can replace presence and proximity. If we want to build trust, if we want communities to feel free to tell us what they think of us, we have to be present, and you have to be near people. And it's also a matter of respect, and it's also a matter of honoring our humanitarian principles. How can you do an independent assessment of needs if you're not there? And when I say if you are not there, I don't refer to me, the Nasara, going to the villages necessarily, yes? To finish, I want to share with you, from the many challenges that still exist, I want to underline 3 of them and finish with an anecdote. Many challenges ahead. This is as simple as possible, as complex as necessary. I think it's something that all the male people can relate to. So one thing linked to the tacit knowledge capturing and linked to the importance of understanding the context, but at the same time taking advantage of all the learning that exists at systematic level. So balancing the context tailor with the lessons learned from the humanitarian system is far from being an obvious one. And where to find that balance point it's again up to us to be critically analyzing how. We were saying that this research, this actual research validated again that multiple mechanisms is better, but at the same time we're claiming that we have to keep it simple. It's a bit of a conundrum, that one, right? And taking into account what we say about non-homogeneous groups and different types of complaints, and how sometimes ladies prefer one type of mechanism, men other, etc., another conundrum. And finally, again, I want to stress on the local knowledge versus the international standards. Again, it's similar to the one up above, but the one above focuses more on the learning aspects, and this one focuses more on what is going to guide us. We have numerous initiatives, and we have at the same time the richness and diversity of what we find in the field is something that we have to find a balance point. My time is over, so before we go to clarification questions, I want to finish by telling you that after each key interview I did with the imams, with the chef de village, and with the beneficiaries, I asked them, could you please give me an advice to do my work better after the discussion we have had? And I was quite impressed with the fact that there was a unanimity, remarkable. People said to me, please keep on smiling. And we can dismiss this as anecdotal and a bit, I don't know, hippie flowers. But at the same time, when I am interacting with somebody, I like people that are respectful and smile at me. So maybe there is much more than a smile down there. As Maya Angelou says, people forget what you say, and people forget even what you do, but they will never forget how you make them feel. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions for clarification from the presentation?
Richard from Gold. Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. And just one comment, it's very specific in relation to not getting people to do fill in complaints books for you. And one of the mechanisms we've looked at using is, what extent we will use community logbooks. Are you talking about that you found that community logbooks don't work?
Yeah. I mean, many times there's this misunderstanding that your complaints response mechanism is not working unless you have a lot of complaints documented. And I think this is a bit simplistic. So the logbooks were not working in the communities, but that didn't mean that there were no complaints. That means that the complaints and helping with the NFI distribution committees that we have set up in Agadez and in Walam, they were dealing themselves with it. So in their understanding, we're not going to bother Oxfam with something that we already solved at field level. So in discussions, we were able to make them understand that for us it's very important to be able to comprehend that they were doing that good job solved at local level. Yeah? Complaints response mechanisms many times gets perceived as a form of fiscalization, like checking, and many times like our partners were reluctant, thinking that we wanted to check their performance. But once you have the discussion going and you stress a lot on the feedback issues too, not only the complaint on the negative side, that has a stigma on it. So yeah, what we were suggesting is the logbooks are fine, but when you do your community visits, you have the most amazing tool. Sit under the tree with people, talk about what they have been doing, and you as humanitarian, you have a responsibility to write down, analyze, and give them feedback on their job. Yeah.
Just to share a little bit, we're just conducting accountability assessment in Malawi.
Okay.
We were coming up with all sorts of written forms and 3 or 4 different versions, looking at anti units and everything else. And the feedback overwhelming from back from communities of we want open meetings and we want you to keep doing lots of open meetings. Not even individual and not even something that was useful for sensitive complaints. We want open meetings with everyone there.
Yeah.
And which is the same thing we've all been doing for years and years.
Yeah.
They don't stop doing that. You know?
Right. Very important. Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that in question and answer. Is it on the presentation? Okay, really good.
Okay. I'm Hari Krishna from EC Board.
Namaste.
Thanks for excellent presentation. I'm very pleased to see the genuine humanitarian approach in your work. Very rare. And my question is, although what you presented really brings out your real experiences in the field of listening to the communities, but I would imagine it's not as straightforward, as simple as it is.
We had 10 minutes, yeah.
So my question is, what are the challenges you faced, especially dealing with the local organizers, local NGOs? Sometimes when you go and listen to communities, they are in a fix sometimes. Sometimes they may feel that they are overpowered, or they may feel that something may be told against them. So did you face any challenges like that, or how did you manage that?
I think it's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think that it's something we'll come back to in all of the presentations.
I want to
It's okay,
but
great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just in the interest of time, we're going to move on. Lupate Nathi is the meal advisor with World Vision in Sudan. And it's really great to have him here also because World Vision Sudan hosted one of the 3 case studies that CDA and ALNAP did together, trying to look at what makes feedback mechanisms effective. And there's copies in the back, or if not, they're on your the flip drives that you got. And he's going to share with us some of the lessons from their work in with food aid programs in the camps in Darfur.
Yes, I'm just going to go straight to my presentation. I'm just going to take you through the lessons and experiences and successes in World Vision Sudan in Darfur region. This is the mechanism that implemented in the IDP camps with a caseload of over 500,000 beneficiaries and almost 100,000 school children. So the type of mechanism that implemented suggestion boxes and community help desk. Right. My presentation abstract, I'll try to explore how establishing and using feedback mechanism can contribute to broader work around improving accountability to affected populations. And I also highlight how feedback mechanism can complement information provision, communication, and consultation with aid recipients. And then lastly, I'll share challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned by World Vision Sudan in designing and adapting feedback mechanism in South Darfur in the IDP camps. Before we started implementing our feedback mechanism, we had some questions and some queries that were posed, both from internal and from outside. Those are some of the queries and questions that were posed by our stakeholders and our staff when we started to implement our feedback mechanism. We asked, why collect more complaints from these people, yet we have so many unsolved questions? So this came from the authorities. When we approached the authorities for permits, for authority to implement our feedback mechanism. It was implemented, it was not at the beginning of the intervention. The intervention started in 2004, but we started implementing our feedback mechanism in 2008. So it was in between. So there were questions that we asked. So people had gotten used to a system where we are implementing without the feedback mechanism. So that's some of the questions that were asked by the complaints, because they're saying these are the people in the IDP. They've got so many issues that they've been raising to their governments, to the authorities, but now we're saying we want to implement a complaints response mechanism. Now, based on that, we decided that we would not use the word complaints handling mechanism, because initially, when we had attempted, wanted to establish a complaints handling mechanism as per the HAP benchmark. But then we decided that, okay, maybe the word complaints was not in good taste to the authorities. So we changed the way to say, we're saying we want to establish an issues, comments, suggestions handling mechanism, so that there be a link between the aid recipients and World Vision. We also had some of the issues that were raised. This will not work in our culture. We have got a tendency in our community in Tafua where everything, no, it's culturally not acceptable. Yeah. It will not work in this culture. It will not work because probably everything has to come through men. We may not be able to use this one. So the cultural issues, like our staff behind the culture. This will bring more workload for us. That's where to start, because they've gotten used to implementation without a feedback mechanism. So they felt this was an add-on to what they already been doing. Then this is as kind of a suggestion, if it's not tailor-made to our context, it will not work. So they say, the context that we're referring to is like, how are the communities channeling their issues to whoever? Could it be to the government, to the people that are assisting them? They've got a traditional method that they use to channel their issues to the authorities, to the aid organizations. They wanted it to be molded around that. Right, we had some key questions. Based on all what I've just said, we went to the drawing board and said, okay, these are the questions that we needed to answer. What, how, and why. Yep. We needed to know what mechanism would be appropriate for this community. So the what questions were so critical to us that we needed to get some answers on what we need to do, what mechanism, what complaints, what parameters do we need to put in place so that our mechanism is not viewed as maybe getting other complaints outside than our programming. How are we going to do it? Right? So we needed to know how are we going to do, what mechanism is appropriate for this context, and how are we going to train, how are we going to select the committees that will handle the committees and all that kind of stuff. And why? Because our staff also, they needed to know all these things, so that as we go and build the capacity and train the communities, because the system needs to be known by the communities. So they needed to know why we are doing it. Right? Feedback mechanism and other accounting components. This is after we established the system, we realized that giving feedback to aid recipient enabled World Vision to provide information, engage on regular basis. So because we are getting feedback from the aid recipient, we were going back to the beneficiaries and give feedback. So it gives us that opportunity to be continuously engaged with the aid recipients. Soliciting and acting on feedback from aid recipient promoted consultation, communication between World Vision and build trust. Because we they were raising some issues, we are attending some issues, positive and negative. Not all the issues that we're raising we are attending to, we are solving them. Some were maybe beyond the scope of the projects. Some were maybe due to pipeline issues, like we are distributing food. They would say, change vegetable oil because it's smelly, because of the fortification. They wanted their own traditional vegetable oil, the groundnut oil, that they would just pour on top of the food without maybe cooking it. So they say, please change. But because of the pipeline issues and other logistical issues, something that could not just be solved. So, but we go back to them and give them that feedback, that this is something that cannot be changed, but because of ABCD. So that kind of feedback, they really appreciated it because they were raising some issues, but we still go back to them and give them the feedback. Based on feedback from beneficiary acceptance and realistic participation strategies were developed, because we are continuously engaged, talking to them, raising issues, attending to the issues. So then in the process, we are able to come up with some ways how they would want to participate, even in the school feeding interventions where they participated in managing the food. Like in Sudan, even the food, we just send it to the ADP. They'll get the food, they'll participate in the distribution, or that they would give us some suggestions on how they would want to participate. Okay, continuing to our experiences, respecting cultural setup and involving the community as women and children promoted acceptance of the system. We went to the community and tried to understand how they would want to channel information to World Vision and how they would want to receive information. So we respected the cultural setup. The cultural setup is like information has to come. If you want to talk to women, you have first of all talk to the sheikh. Convince the sheikh why we have to talk to women. So, but still, if you've convinced the sheikh, we still go back and talk directly to women and children. So that's the cultural setup. If you just go and talk to children, to women, without maybe getting the approval from the sheikh, we'll have broken one of the cultural norms. So we respected that, and then we worked through that, and we were able to get acceptance. Setting clear parameters for a feedback system based on simplified guidelines made it easy for front-end staff to roll out the mechanism. We simplify it, like we say we agreed that we set up the community help desk. They're going to set up suggestion boxes. But we needed to come up with the guidelines on what issues, comments, suggestions will our community help desk handle. So that we don't just open it to other things, including maybe political things that will put us into trouble. So that when our front-end staff went to the field to train, they were training based on the already developed guidelines for both community help desk and our suggestion boxes. Everything was just made simple so that it was understood. And we also translated these tools to Arabic. Yeah. It means understanding of the mechanism by both staff and the community. Because we also train the communities. The community, the CSD is like community help desk focal persons, we take them through training, and in between we do some refresher training. So the training were like the guidelines were translated to Arabic. Creation of the database made it possible to analyze and timely compare process reports. So like we're receiving so many complaints. So imagine we are receiving these complaints from like about 42 FDPs. We're receiving so many complaints coming from different ADPs. So we had to come up with a mechanism of how we're going to synthesize and consolidate these reports so that we can give to management to take action. So we came up with a simple database where we are able to say, if you ask me, what are the issues that are coming from ADPA? I'll be able to tell you these are the issues and how many are they, maybe pertaining to people that claim they've not received food because they've lost their ration card. I should be able to tell you, like with the click of a button, okay, from this ADP, we're able to get this number of people complain that they did not receive food because they've lost their ration cards. So with that database, we're able to do that, to analyze and compile a report that we give is maybe one-page table, analyze everything with ADP names, the complaints, and how many there are within that. Okay. And the competence-based learning lab improved capacity of the field teams in mainstreaming mechanism. Like as World Vision, we're doing a lot of training, capacity building, training labs on DMNE and accountability, and this has helped in mainstreaming the accountability mechanism. And then with adequate resources in terms of money, personnel, and simplified documents, the program account framework, food assistance, and the food assistance accountability policy that guides our accountability mechanism. Lessons learned, we learned that introducing accountability system feedback mechanism midway into the program implementation raised a lot of questions. Like I said that we had been implementing our food assistance program, but we then in between to introduce accountability mechanism, then it raised a lot of questions. Why now? Why did you start at the beginning? So it raised a lot of questions. Aligning complex thinking mechanism traditional methods used by the community to equivalence, increase acceptance and trust. Those are some of the lessons that we learned. Developing simple and user-friendly tools and guidelines led to smooth training and rollout of the system. We had to come up with a monitoring system embedded into our post-distribution monitoring so that we understand how the system is working and also make some improvements. I managed to beat the time. I think I'm getting 2 minutes.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I hope I was
So are there any questions for clarification?
You thought that you were using the acronym ADP. That's what does that stand for?
Okay, IDP, Internally Displaced Person.
Oh, IDP. Sorry.
IDP?
Yes.
Yeah, Internally Displaced Person. And then I also use FDP, Food Distribution Point.
Okay.
And ADP, right?
No, I didn't use ADP. We don't have an area development program. ADP is area development program. We don't have an area development program in Sudan.
Okay, thank you. So our last presentation is going to be joint. Francesca Bonino, who's I think most people know. Who doesn't know Francesca from all that? She, covers evaluation, learning, and accountability research for ALNAP. And my colleague Isabella Jean, who is the Director of Learning and Evaluation at CDA. And they, for the last year and a half, I guess, have been working together to do some case studies and to put together this summary and guidance that has just come out on what makes humanitarian feedback mechanisms effective. Granted, it's 3 case studies, but hopefully I think it's also been looking at a lot of other examples from other people in the literature as well. And they're going to share a bit of that, and I think there are copies hopefully in the back as well. And I just want to mention it's really great to have Manuel Pereira, who is with IOM in Pakistan, and hosted them in the 3 case studies were Lupati's program and in Darfur, the IOM and the shelter cluster programming in Pakistan, and then with IFRC in Haiti. And so it's great to have 2 of the 3 people, at least in the room, who can also share a little bit more when we have discussions.
And I just wanted to mention that Sharon is here, and she presented on IFRC's Beneficiary Communications Program yesterday, which was the 3rd case study.
Thank you, Dana. I'm here and I'm going to start this presentation that I'm sharing with Isabella, and also to emphasize how special it is to have in the room, how unique it is and special for me and Isabella, having worked on this for 2 years, and to have the host of our case study and the 3 agencies who volunteer to have us and take us around and really opening the door to both their staff in the offices and also facilitate our meetings with the community. What I'm going to talk about in this presentation, let me say it's basically I would want to give you an idea of what is different about this presentation and about this actual research that we have done. I would want to introduce, if you bear with me, just one slide with definition. How did we define feedback loop and a feedback mechanism? Very often the terms are used and the concise definition, precise definition are left implicit. And thirdly, between me and Isabella, we are going to share 6 main findings based collectively on the analysis that we have done based on the country case study. So our main question was, what makes feedback mechanism in humanitarian context effective? What makes them work? And I'm really pleased that we are actually coming as a 3rd presenter, because both Luz and Lupate, they have actually touched on a lot of the keywords that you will see explained and presented in the guidance document. And so this makes also quite interesting the discussion in terms of validation, also from other agencies and other experience. What we have done and what makes this action research different, we wanted to go back to the affected population and the aid recipients and ask feedback to them on the feedback mechanism. So if you wish, it's a feedback loop or about the feedback loop. We wanted to ask them what is their perception of how these mechanisms are established and used by agencies in different contexts. It was also very important for us to triangulate what we heard from crisis-affected people with agency staff. As Lupate was mentioning, it is also important to do some groundwork within the agency, among the frontline staff, so that they are also aware why we are doing this. And the second element that makes our action research different is that we wanted to concentrate not only on the data collection element, which is very important to trigger the feedback loop, so that you actually collect issues, comments, suggestions from the program participants you work with, but also, very importantly, and this was an element that from the literature review appeared to be very neglected, we wanted to focus on how feedback information is used for day-to-day program improvement, especially, mid-course correction, which I think it's also what Luz was emphasizing, and day-to-day running of the program. So this was our scope. How feedback data is used to inform decision-making and make program changes, especially on a day-to-day, even mid-course correction. So these were the 2 key features that we embedded in the methodology we used for this case study. Based on the 3 field visits, we have analyzed this data using a pattern matching approach. It is all explained in the methodology. In a nutshell, we try to detect whether there is any pattern between some features of the feedback mechanism that we observe in the country and whether these feature also correlate with those mechanisms that are perceived by affected population as more effective. So this was the analysis, so that we tried to come up with a practitioner guidance, which is what you have here, that is as much as possible based on evidence that has been triangulated across cases and based on desk-based and literature review. So I'm afraid now I am gonna come to the one slide which is about definition, just to get the terminology right. Yesterday, John Mitchell had a presentation from our background paper, and he also hinted to how important it is, the taxonomy and the definition of the term. You remember he had the engagement arrow, and he spent a few minutes just giving a definition of exactly where we are, when are we talking about these different issues. And feedback loop, feedback mechanism, what is a closed and open feedback loop means, are often left as implicit definition. And so our definition is that a feedback mechanism for us is a set of procedures and tools formally, I'm going to go back to formally, established and used to allow humanitarian aid recipients, and in some cases other crisis-affected population, to provide information on their experience of a humanitarian agency, or perhaps even of the broader humanitarian system. That was the case of the Listening Project, for instance. So that feedback mechanism can also function as part of broader monitoring practices, case of both IOM and Pakistan and Sudan World Vision. They can also collect a variety of information that can be used for different purposes, including taking corrective actions to improve some elements of the humanitarian response. A feedback loop is seen as effective if, at minimum, it supports the collection, acknowledgement, and analysis, very important, of the feedback that is received. And whether or not the issue at stake is resolved, as the example of the groundnut oil or the smelling oil from Sudan, whether or not you can bring a resolution to the issue or the query that is bringing your attention, if you go back, relying some response and explanation back to the community, that is a case where we and Isabella, we were documenting, this is an example of a closed feedback loop. And here we come to the 6 findings that we selected for you, so that we could share some of the highlights from the analysis we conducted that is reflected in the guidance. So the question that we had that informed our research is what makes feedback mechanisms work. Yeah. And the first is that formal is not always better. Formal is not always better. Which goes against the purpose of what we started to research, because feedback mechanism we design as a formal set of procedure. Yep. This is what we try to test in the field. Is it always true? What we find out is that actually you may already have some mechanism, some practices, some participatory practices already embedded in how your program is working, how your program is designed, and you may already get the information that you need from your from the community you work with. You may already get this information from other channels. And so the desire to formalize should be really carefully judged and assessed against the purpose of what is the additional information that I don't get currently from what I have already in place with my community in terms of two-way communication, participatory monitoring and evaluation. If you already get the information that you need, then our suggestion would be strengthen what you have and don't just formalize just for the sake of adding new communication tool, because it could go against the purpose of your feedback mechanism. And now I'm going to pass on to Isabella, who is going to proceed with sharing with you more findings.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And just to note, there are 15 findings in the guidance, and we're only presenting 6 here. And we really urge you to look through the guidance document. In terms of in a setup and a design stage, of course, we focused quite a bit on that, and the staff who were involved there from the beginning and who were running the mechanisms at the point of our visit had quite a bit to say retrospectively on what was learned on the setup and the design of the mechanism. A huge piece of it is really being clear about the purpose, the why. Why are we doing this? What is this for? Who is this for? And obviously, managing the expectations right from the start. And to do this well, you really have to consult with both the agency-based users, the users within your own organizations, at all levels, not just people who will be sorting it, but the senior managers, the decision makers, and of course the users of the mechanism in the affected communities, the people who will in fact be interfacing with the feedback mechanism on a potentially daily basis. So this issue around communicating the purpose, how it will function, and what to expect from the feedback process is very critical right from the start, and also keep communicating it. We had a graphic designer, an illustrator who actually did this original drawings based on the case study text, so it's been really wonderful to work with him. The other piece that we wanted to emphasize, and of course nothing new, not a flashpoint, is really paying attention and allocating enough time at the design stage to consider all the various factors to make the feedback channels appropriate and accessible to a variety of actors in the community. So things like accessibility by gender, financial cost, if it's an SMS system, can people afford it, is it going to be free, all the various things. I won't go into detail. As well as concerns around anonymity and confidentiality for potentially sensitive topics, but also if people want to remain anonymous while complaining or making suggestions around staff conduct and other issues. I will echo what Lou's already said. People in every single place we visited prefer multiple channels. We heard this repeatedly from different people at different levels in the community, leaders, women, marginalized people, people in committees. Everybody truly appreciated the face-to-face contact, which continued to be an option even while other systems have been set up. Suggestion boxes, call centers, SMS-based systems, and so on. So it really cannot be, should not be replaced. The other piece, of course, is resources. How much does this cost? What do we need to really think about when we're setting up feedback mechanisms and the various resource implications? It's clear from all of our interviews with staff and senior management in the agencies that planning ahead and allocating sufficient resources to how the data will be sorted, analyzed, verified, all the various steps that are incredibly important for this to actually be useful and actionable for decision makers. Analysis is particularly an important piece and a big gap and a weak point in many of the feedback mechanisms, just something we know from literature review as well. The piece around developing analytical capacity to actually process and make sense of the data that you are collecting and interpret it and be able to offer it in a usable format, as well as hiring staff who can do this well and appropriately based on being able to reach women, minorities, different language groups, marginalized groups, and so on. So this is a really important piece, especially when it comes to face-to-face contact. The flexibility to change, a very critical point. Our focus on utilization was really an important piece that brought out this reflection in a retrospective reflection on how feedback is actually being used for decision making. And one statement that we are making in the guidance very confidently, because it also echoes every single person that we've talked to within the agency, is that if you don't have flexibility to modify your programs, if you just know right from the start that there's almost no margin for any kind of tweaking or changes, you really shouldn't be asking a broad feedback, because that goes against the purpose of establishing an effective mechanism. You have to work on both collecting the data and also making that margin wider and continuously advocating for the ability to use feedback to make course corrections. So designing a feedback mechanism that in fact provides reliable and timely information to program staff for decision making and making it actionable is a really important piece, where staff at various levels, not just in meal teams and program teams, but also at the decision-making level, both at the country and headquarters and wherever else, and others, implementing partners, others who have some decisions to make on how they would adjust the programming, really need to understand what they can expect and how they can use this data, including things like changes in strategy at the higher level. changes in program design, and using feedback data for advocacy. Really interesting examples of Oxfam using feedback data, even in Darfur, which is a rather restricted environment, for advocacy at in Khartoum around increasing more funding for livelihoods and so on. So we've gathered some really interesting examples on that as well. In case you can't see, the person sitting in a chair says, I have decision-making powers but no responsibility for managing feedback, and the person collecting data is responsible for managing feedback but have no decision-making authority. This point is an important one. We have not resolved this. We raised this question very, straightforwardly, both in the synthesis document, in the research study, and in the guidance. Where do you locate this feedback function in your organization? Where does it sit in your organigram really matters. However, we haven't done enough case studies and we haven't had enough of evidence to actually come up with a specific model to advocate for a particular model. Should it sit within the program teams? Should it sit as a separate meal team? Should it be embedded? We've seen all kinds of setups, and there are advantages and disadvantages in all of them. Happy to discuss them. I think it's really an open question still. And of course, the main finding on closing the feedback loop is that there needs to be a response, that the data needs to be utilized. And you have to really pay attention to both solicited feedback and unsolicited feedback. The suggestions, the complaint feedback that arrive to you through various other means without you actually asking, through this informal means, where things that you set up yourself might actually just display some already existing feedback across channels that the community is still more comfortable using. On the decision making, I've already mentioned some of these points, but it really takes some planning ahead and thinking ahead on who within your organization needs the information, how frequently, in what format, how will they be using it, and what exactly can you do? How can you shape this data in terms of trends, like what Lupate produces based on his database queries, trends across several months, across a year? What does this mean? How do we make sense of this? And actually having these conversations, having a standing agenda item in your staff meetings, who needs to hear it, and so on. A really important point, I think, that gets missed on some of the design and setup decisions that are made. So much is spent on how we're going to collect the data and not enough on how we're going to analyze it, who needs to hear it, how we're going to actually use it, and making that a routine process. And actually creating demand for feedback within your agency so that your senior decision makers are demanding it, not just for reporting and accountability purposes, going up, but actually for their use, for their decision-making purposes. And finally, our sixth finding is please share your lessons, your tools, your failed attempts at doing this within your own larger organizations, with your implementing partners, with cluster members. Share the resources, and of course refer the feedback itself. That's another huge piece on how information is shared. I just want to point out that if you have questions to Lupate on how the feedback is used and the food assistance program there, the internal communication and information loops that exist within the food assistance program in World Vision Sudan are as important as what happens in the feedback collection with communities. What he does with the food distribution managers is on an everyday basis to keep sharing information internally is equally important in the setup of this whole system. So it's a really critical point. And I'll stop there. Thank you, and we're open for questions.
Great. Great. So are there any questions for clarification on the presentation or the guidance?
Tendi Tinistana with the British Red Cross. Thank you very much for the presentation, but also for the study. My question is really quick, and it is mainly for clarification. In your study, have you come across the issue of distinction between feedback and complaints at all?
This was a huge issue at the beginning because, especially in the literature, a lot of the literature generated on the subject of complaints response mechanism, feedback mechanism, and complaints and response mechanism was driven by a lot of the early work, excellent and still very, very relevant today, a lot of the research conducted by HAP. One of the standards that is precisely about complaints. The focus, Danish Refugee Council, Complaints Manual, excellent resource. The focus of the literature is mainly on complaints. Feedback tended to be dealt a bit as an add-on. Yes. So we wanted to be quite clear in our scoping decision, the one that we took at the beginning before going to the field and documenting the different experience, that we were actually looking at feedback mechanisms, so mechanisms that were dealing with day-to-day questions related to implementation and not suggestion, issues for consideration, so which is our definition of feedback, and not only or not exclusively to issues that may have legal even implication for mismanagement, wrongdoing, embezzlement, if I'm looking at manual, so issues that may have legal that came out wrong. I'm thinking at the shelter cluster and IO in Pakistan. So there is definitely a double case load. There is a case load that is often dealt for more serious issues that are complaints, and that is often handled in a different way. So if you imagine there is a flow chart when the information comes to your agency doorstep, there is often some sort of triage happening. And if there are information, for instance, in terms of allegation of sexual exploitation and abuse, mismanagement, staff misbehavior, this would be handled in a different way, and there are often procedures that are better formed and more accepted because complaints handling has a longer history of being documented with dedicated staff. I'm thinking protection staff, the protection cluster in many settings, or sexual exploitation abuse advisor. So we focused on feedback. And then there is a second issue. So there is one about definition, case load, and literature that is not often that's very thin on feedback. And then there is a second issue that Lupat actually introduced. In certain contexts, the issue of complaints and feedback has a political connotation. It's quite charged. And so in terms of acceptability of your system, you may have to present it in a way, as Lupat has done in Sudan, where you are defining and presenting it as a feedback mechanism, because complaints may put you in a situation where authorities may feel that you are replacing them, or it is their role. In Pakistan is often the case. De facto, these are complaints, but the mechanism, it's called a feedback mechanism because it gains more acceptability.
Other questions?
I'm interested in the experience of the panel in looking at feedback mechanisms in operational areas where we're managing remotely. I'm thinking specifically of Syria at the moment. I'm just interested in any learning that came out from research or any practical experience that can be shared as well.
My former colleague Kim, who is sitting just there, because he conducted a mini case study for the Humanitarian Innovation Fund in Somalia. He can talk a little bit about it. It's also mentioned in the publication, because that was the case of Danish Refugee Council community-based reconstruction program, if I'm correct. And they have been using an SMS-based feedback mechanism, which received funding from the HIF. So this would be one literature source. Secondly, I think there has been more experience that unfortunately it's not documented among some of the UK DEC agencies who are operating in Syria and who are starting to discuss with their operational team how operating in a remote environment can still offer opportunities, for instance, using some of the SMS-based or even radio-based tool to get in touch with populations that are hard to reach. Unfortunately, that is not often documented. Perhaps, Kim, do you have any other experience on the remote?
Well, we actually, the HIP Commission gave a grant to Timber's project in Afghanistan, looking at reviewing a range of remote monitoring and accountability approaches, which was being used by agencies, and I can share that with people. The experience in Somalia, which was the DRC, was using SMS for feedback. But I think what's important there is it wasn't a standalone system, it was integrated into a program which was based on a large level of integration of systems and groups really thinking the program design, and it was actual components of that which was particularly useful when security systems was deteriorating and as much as possible to replace them into ongoing dialogue.
Yes. And I forgot, definitely also another HIF grantee was actually Tier Fund in Afghanistan. Some of the most comprehensive and documented, well-researched piece was from Brian Norman, who was the disaster management team leader in Afghanistan, who has written about participatory and remote and many practices in Afghanistan. And so that is also another piece that we can share, and it's on the HIF website.
Yeah, can I compliment? Yeah. Specifically for Syria, if you remember in the presentation, the bubbles about the minimum quality information, that was a distillation that was very required for the Oxfam programs, because one of our strategies to work inside Syria is to work with a very heterogeneous and broad variety of organizations. Some of them are literally neighbors that have got together to make collective soups, like in the Latin America style. So it was the one before. So it was extremely interesting, according to the feedback I got on the training that we did with some of these partners, to get like a simple way to explain why this component is important and what type of information would be relevant for us in terms of people's perceived needs and level of satisfaction. So basically, at the end of the day, I think it was Save the Children precisely that you had an excellent piece on humanitarian at the crossroad, where maybe it was even you saying at the end of the video, how can we say we do a good job unless we know, at least have a remote idea of if people are satisfied and happy with our work or not. It comes down to that, and it links also with the question of Arabic that we're going to retake again.
Yeah, I want to come back just to, because I know your question didn't get answered, and ask all of you to talk a little bit about what some of the, you touched quite a lot on the challenges already, but specifically I think a little bit in terms of the power issues, both internal, because a lot of this has to do with how this is handled internally within organizations, and also, and then externally in terms of the communities, and how you see these possibly helping to shift the power and really and being a way of actually empowering and engaging people in a way that does help them to, they're not making the decisions, but influencing the decisions a little bit more, and how you see that.
What I realized in Sudan when we started, the sheikhs wanted to control everything.
Yeah.
But then we allowed it to go like that for a little while, because we had taught ourselves that this has to be done like in an incremental way. We allowed the sheikhs to take control. In the process, we are trying to educate them that this is a community, it's for all beneficiaries. In the process, they started allowing even women to be community help desk, community focal persons. But I think it needed like for them to first maybe trust what we're doing, and to build that trust between World Vision and the sheikhs. Then gradually they started releasing that power to other people, to the women specifically, where they didn't want in the initial stages, because they really wanted to know what is it all about, probably to just get to understand fully what's all about, so that whether it's something that is there just to dilute their powers as traditional leaders, but then eventually they realized that it was not to be, it's just for the program. Then power was released to the women eventually.
Well, maybe one thing that was particularly interesting from the Niger experience, when we were talking about, when I was referring to the fact that we have to be aware that aid is not central, and the fact that we have to build from what already exists. There were remarkable differences in what the women were saying and what the men were saying, both in Walam and particularly in Agadez, where the Tuareg ladies are very empowered, I have to say, about information sharing, about the fact that you stand up and raise your voice and talk. And for example, that was particularly interesting that men were referring much more to traditional administrative authorities, chef de village, etc., while women were talking much more about the imam. The imams, I interviewed several imams as key interviewers, and they were mentioning themselves that many times when there's intra-violence in the household, the woman would come to them. And the importance, again, I stress again, many times we neglect the religious dimension. I'm not advocating for us to go and participate on the Pray on Friday and pass messages, but at the end of the day, it's beyond our control. Communities have their own mechanisms to share information, feedback, and complaints. And during the Pray on Fridays, Oxfam or our partners were mentioned about what we were doing, about the good work and about the bad work. So in terms of power, I think that we have to be able to balance this line between respecting traditional systems, religious systems that many times we perceive as maybe non-democratical or non-gender friendly, while I think there's much more than this oversimplification. And the fact that women in Niger, in rural areas, were going to talk to the imam, and they had their own solving mechanisms around around the violence intra-home. It was very much related with the fact that how they perceived the power to be exercised as those spaces where they can share their concerns. And the approach of the imam, if you want, was quoting a lot the Quran and was a bit poetic in a way. But there's so many things that we can better understand with whom we are working, so we are able to provide communities with that space to express themselves in the terms, even if it's magical or religious, and in the terms that they, I'm sure with the sheikhs in Darfur it was the same thing. And in fact, when I was in Darfur as a program manager, and we have here Mari Carmen that replaced me afterwards when we were in MSF, it's a silly story, but at the same time it says a lot. Yeah. At the end of my time in Darfur, they said to me, "Luz, we have to tell you, we are very sorry, but you are a man. You cannot be a woman." Yeah. And that for them was a compliment. Okay, we can take it in the bad sense of okay, thank you. But at the end of the day, if we go beyond our mindset and really engage with people, there is where the exercise of power can get in a much more rich and useful at the end of the day way. Yeah?
I'll touch on the internal power dynamics. There is the finding in the guidance number 14 on developing a feedback culture inside the organization. It's the one that relates to this very closely in terms of hearing national staff in every single organization we visited, and it goes beyond just these three that we mentioned, World Vision, IOM, and IFRC. We visited others as well from many case studies in each place. So hearing national staff, local staff, and implementing partners say, look, if I give feedback to my manager, to my supervisor, to the senior management, and it is not acknowledged, it is not heard or not responded to or acted on. I give it once, I give it twice, I give it 3 times. What's the point? I will just, stop doing it. Yeah. So there's a very powerful, association with how community members must feel when we do this. Definitely important power dynamics. We can't unpack all of these institutional issues, but what we've seen as good practice is problem-solving culture that exists. For example, what we saw in IOM, Pakistan, and Hyderabad office. This really powerful information sharing and involving the staff in a lot of the decisions that certainly addresses some of this, but they're not gone. They're there. Mm-hmm. And I think we wanted to ask Manuel, if you want, perhaps to speak on at the community level in terms of the power issues. Right?
I'll just talk on one point that I think it's more important for me and in what ALNAP and CDA did, that is the importance of the feedback loop. I and my team believe that shelter is not a product, it's a process. And a process has a lot of variables. The moment that and the effort we invested on the feedback mechanism was to transform what on our project proposal, on our budget, on our contracts was a product into a process. Because we know how much the house costs, how much we pay, how many tranches, how we transfer the money, how we do the trainings, but we are not listening. If we just do this, we are not listening to the limitations, the potential, and the assumptions or aspirations that the communities have. And having a feedback mechanism that goes and reach out to them, to what they think is bad, what they think needs to be done, and try to bring that back to the process and make changes, that transforms a product into a process and delivers a consistent and much stronger result. I can say that, for example, on the beginning of the program, we decided that people would receive 26,000 rupees, which is equivalent to $300 at the time. But by the end of the program, the rupee had depreciated so much that 26 were not 26, were 30. We had money in the program, and by the request of the person, we were able to convince the senior management to increase the initial budget for every family from the 26 to the 30. administratively and in budget and in orders and contracts is a gigantic effort, but it compensates because it's not fair to ask people to do the shelter knowing that the materials are more expensive. We have the money. And the feedback mechanism helped these, and in many other things. It helped people understand the vulnerability of their shelters. It helped us understand where fraud was, where there were conflicts of land, where we needed to go directly and talk to the communities and solve these problems. So I think this is the best thing that we did in terms of transforming a product into a process was this feedback, because it made it solid. And we are talking about 22,000 houses, because this is what we built, is 160,000 people that had different opinions on how their house should look like. And, well, they had choice. There were a lot of models and they could do things their way, but they needed to feel reverberate in the organization how they could do that and how we could help them do that.
So, other questions? Comments? I'll take right at you.
I have a question based off, your experience and your research. So, which are the best ways? So, when we receive feedback or complaints, and for some reason we cannot, absorb in our program, we cannot change. There might be some limitation with no time. Whatever is the case. So, how we go back to the community, and how do we explain, and how this can be accepted or not? So, when we cannot, close the loop, where we cannot really integrate the feedback in our program, what do we do? Do we create expectation and then we are not able to, to respect?
Across the three cases, across the three main case study and the smaller case study that we conducted, what we realized that, of course, the agency get often better equipped at capturing, sorting, filing, and analyzing information, feedback, and issues that relates to what is going on in terms of their program and their day-to-day activity, because they have a user for that information, which is program manager, could be cluster focal point. So that information that is relevant for what they are working on, that gets sorted. And that was the main focus. This is the main focus of our guidance. How do you make this work? However, very soon, talking to people, we realized that when we had the focus group discussion with community members, they indeed have also used the feedback channel that perhaps are put at the disposal of a food distribution program, also to share other issues that go way beyond what World Vision could do, for instance, or what shelter cluster would do. And two things, or if the relocation program in IFRC Haiti, I'm thinking. So what we happen, two good practice that we have seen agencies are doing is the first, to at least capture that feedback, even if you don't have any immediate relevance or use in the immediate. Because often you get feedback. This was tier fund in Sudan. Some feedback on the type of seeds, for instance, that is used, is only going to be relevant in the next season when it's going to be used. And so for him, for the country director, it's very important to be aware of feedback that goes beyond what is happening at the moment. And so this was one experience, seasonality. Make sure that you have a place, a repository where you capture this feedback and you can retrieve it when it's a moment to discuss them. In another experience from Oxfam America, Sudan, Isabella mentioned, is the advocacy. A lot of the issues that were collected by IDP, from IDP in the IDP camps, were talking about income generation, opportunity, or livelihood, which are very politically difficult issues to raise, but they were actually discussed at the capital level with the Common Humanitarian Fund. They have a working group, and they managed over time, thanks to some advocacy work done by an NGO coalition there, to revise the list of items eligible for pool funds and common humanitarian funds. And that was a big achievement for them, because Oxfam America or World Vision would not be able alone to tackle those issues that goes beyond their remit and scope of work.
Just briefly, the other piece is shelter cluster in Pakistan obviously is a referral mechanism. It's a coordination mechanism wherein a platform on which information flows constantly. So because IOM's feedback mechanism very much is shelter cluster focal points are very much also people who are listening and responding. They were able to refer information that doesn't fit into your box, but fits into somebody else's mandate. So that was an informal mechanism, but quite well functioning.
I'll also give you maybe 2 examples from Tafor. We are distributing food, we are giving school children a meal at school, a midday meal at school. But they were also giving us feedback on the status of the classrooms. That the children are so congested, they're sitting on the floor, the problem uncovered roof and all kind of stuff. But based on that feedback that we got from the children, World Vision was able to talk to the support offices to mobilize some funds that we to use to construct some semi-permanent classrooms in the IDP camps. But this is like maybe a bit outside from the food for education intervention. The other example that we had is we're giving people grain, sorghum. Then the feedback that we got was we are battering part of this sorghum to get the sorghum that they're giving us meal. In the process, we are diluting the amount of the food that is getting to the household. And then what we are paying for the grinding using the sorghum is much more than what we pay when we are using cash. Based on that feedback, World Vision Sudan was able to think of a mechanism how they can help the beneficiaries to mill their sorghum. Then World Vision Germany was approached to come up with a milling voucher intervention that we rolled out in a pilot basis for some time. Then it was scaled up to almost all of the IDP camps. So this was based from the feedback that we're getting from the communities. And then now the milling voucher is now the in thing in Darfur.
I'm very pleased that there is a distinction being made here between more formalized, and they need to be so, complaint handling systems that deal with serious abuses of power and more general feedback. And indeed some organizations like World Vision have managed very well to incorporate the two. And I think it's still worth emphasizing that while the entry point for more generic programmatic feedback should more often than not be informal, when we are talking about complaint handling, so issues of sexual exploitation and abuse, maladministration, what have you, it is important that a system, at least within the organization, is formalized, so that actually we know what is going to happen with that information, there is an investigations process in place, so on and so forth. And touching upon your point that unless there is a culture of feedback within the organization, it's very difficult that staff will encourage feedback on operations, on programs, more broadly from the community. The same point stands in relation to complaint handling. Research that we did in 2003-2004 at the One World Trust showed that no complaint handling system is effective unless staff have a formalized internal process for raising complaints, and there is a clear whistleblowing policy in place for staff as well. So there's a very clear parallel there between how the organization functions internally, the organizational culture, and how staff will then relate to communities. A very specific question to the party. When we started this work with FPMG in 2007 on complaint handling, a lot of the questions that were coming back from the 36 plus countries where FPMG was operating at the time.
FPMG?
Sorry, Food Program Management Group, which is the way in which World Vision works with food distribution. One of the questions that was coming back from the field at the time was, how much money do we need to set aside to make change in our programs based on the feedback that we receive?
Wow.
There were a lot of questions coming back from program managers at country level saying, should we set aside 4%? Should we set aside 5%? To make sure that if we are getting all this feedback about how we will change our operations, we can then have the leeway, we have the flexibility to adapt. And I'd be curious to know whether any further work has been done in World Vision specifically on that. And the last point, and I promise not to speak for the rest of the day, is about this issue of further referral of feedback, not complaints, feedback in general. When an organization like World Vision, like Oxfam, receives feedback that actually does not concern them directly, how do you refer it on? And are the cluster systems, specifically in emergencies, one of the mechanisms through which this information can be shared? Hannah, I believe, will remember that in Myanmar, post-Nargis, one of the things that were attempted was to work with this amazing team of volunteers who would bring feedback from community. They were called committees, and they were providing feedback at the cluster meetings. And then everyone was trying to scratch their head and say, who's going to do something about this now? But is there scope to actually try to explore that a bit further? And maybe scope for Al now to try and learn some of the things that have been attempted on these lines at cluster level?
Thanks for asking difficult questions. All right, on the budget map set aside for issues that will be attended to when the program has already been started. What I've seen over time is that there is flexibility in a way, like where I am in Darfur. We have a special fund set aside where if there is a critical thing that has been raised by the beneficiary that could have been overlooked during the project design, there is a fund set aside that can be tapped into to take care of such issues. Like the example that I gave you for the construction of semi-permanent schools is something that will not be budgeted for under the proposal that is submitted to WFP. But if that's kind of feedback we get from the beneficiary that there is a critical need that we need to support, since we are supporting the schools, we are promoting retention. How to promote retention when there are no classrooms? So in such instances, there's that way where we can approach our support offices, then they'll be able to fund such parallel or add-on interventions. But to say there's a budget set aside during the proposal, I'm not sure about.
No, just like, sorry.
No, I just wanted to do a follow-up comments on that question. I mean, one of the, sorry, Ben Noble from interviews working with Humanitarian engagement. One of the issues that was raised was how agencies can put money aside. I want to ask another question. In some cases, you have how far are we willing to go into the formal program for feedback, in the sense that you go in the other direction as well. Well, actually, I want cash, I don't want kids. So the amount of money that we use to manage all of these will be less. I need less staff. That's another issue in the other lines going on. And the other comment I wanted to make is the outside comments, feedback, communication, engagement, participation, and so on. I think that there's a question to be raised in terms of coordination, humanitarian coordination. How does that come up? In Haiti, we had to see that. And a lot of this did not come up in discussion, but how does it go up to decision process? It's a very tough one. And it goes for cluster coordination, humanitarian coordinator, and donors as well. Because you mentioned internal decision process in agencies. This is it. How does it go up as well?
On the cluster side is a bit difficult because every cluster is a cluster. But on the case of the shelter cluster is a bit in terms of there were a lot of people asking for health, education, water and sanitation, but there was no money in these clusters. These clusters were no longer active. The only thing that was active was sometimes working groups, or one thing that the ALNAP found out, this basic trust. And trust has a lot to do with interpersonal relations and with personalities that we talked yesterday. And sometimes the most effective way to share information is your network of contacts in other organizations that are doing certain activities, and you pass an email and the information flows. But it's very difficult to maintain when the emergency starts decreasing and you are going into the early recovery phase, how you maintain this information. And there is a need for clusters to have a better mechanism to handle with the needs. Pakistan had 20 million people affected. 500,000 lost their house. We did 100,000 houses. Let's not talk about water, all the other things. So it's very, scale has a lot of impact on that, and I think that's what needs to be managed, is the expectations of people. In our program, when people come to us asking for water and sanitation as a complement to shelter, we always say that we don't have funding for that, we understand the need, we are not promising that we will do this, but we'll make the effort possible to raise awareness on this. If it's education, we have a standard policy to say you need to talk to the government authorities, because it's the government of Pakistan that has to provide for this. People have to have an answer. You have to say something to them. Even if it's, I don't know, they just want to be listened.
Just briefly, yes, on Monica's point related to this, IOM Pakistan is the shelter cluster lead, and when they invited us in, they put this question squarely to us. At the end of this visit, please tell us if you can, if we should formalize the feedback mechanism at the cluster level, if we could actually institutionalize it, or should we run ours and just be responsible since we're the cluster lead? honestly, in the 2 weeks we spent there, we've met incredible Shelby cluster focal points on whose shoulders this responsibility rests to hear at all times and to pass on, to keep referring. And it works because they're capable, because they care, they're committed, and it's the cluster system that provides the platform. The minute they leave, take other jobs, you really do wonder where is this going to go. So we don't have an answer for several reasons. We have not seen an effective joint feedback mechanism or a cluster level feedback mechanism. We would love to research how that works, what makes it effective. We have not heard of one. If you have seen one, if you know one that existed or is being set up in the current emergencies, or have anything to share with us, we'd love to hear it. It's a big question that was left open for us. How does this work? Because we have an effectiveness question evidence-based, not aspirational, not how we think it should work, but what do we know, what has worked in the past.
But two quick things. Do look at what happened post-Nargis, and clearly look at what's happening in Pakistan, and then complaints and broader feedback. Look at what's been done in Dadaab, because there's been a lot of work done in Dadaab, and I believe actually there's some work that's been done about 3-4 years ago in Rwanda as well, setting up a joint feedback and complaint mechanism.
A couple of quick questions. First one, we've heard an awful lot about getting the feedback into organisations for organisational change. I've heard very little about giving feedback on the feedback to the communities. And in many cases, any change might take months. So it feels a bit like it's going into a black hole. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how you feed back to the communities on what you've heard from them. Second quick question, I wonder how much we're using this in host communities as well. Are we actually listening to the host communities, or are we just listening to the IDPs and refugees? Because I think that could deal with a lot of tension issues.
Hi, I'm Anders with the Danish Refugee Council. And first, I would just like to speak to what was mentioned about SMS feedback mechanism in Somalia, which was piloted by ERC. And if you're curious to know more about this, please find me and I can connect you to the people that were involved with that. And I can also just to share with you, inform you that we are piloting, based on the experiences of that, the new mechanism, SMS feedback in Pakistan. But obviously it's not finished yet, and it's a huge challenge to avoid that this becomes some kind of technology-driven process. It needs to have relevant results. So that's the big struggle with using SMS. Okay, then my question, flexibility was raised as one of your highlighted findings here. Flexibility to actually respond to the feedback and the things that you get. And I'm curious, working in an NGO with so many different donor relationships on our contractual obligations in terms of implementing the projects that we've agreed on with the donor. Are there any examples from the organizations which you did your study on, or any other organizations of using information analysis based on feedback mechanisms to revise your programming and actually use it as a qualifying argument for why you are allowed to adjust your program? So feedback used to the donor level, not only within the...
Okay, so one is just how do you, it's not just closing the loop, but actually how are you, in some ways summarizing what you're hearing, and how long, and letting people know maybe it may not be resolved immediately, but just acknowledging so that people do feel heard. And second, of how you've been able to use this feedback to actually get donors to change their approaches or to change their programs. I think you mentioned some of that with advocacy, for example.
Okay. With regards to the feedback back to the communities, yes, sorry. We have a good example of a pilot feedback mechanism we had in South Sudan in 2011. It was associated with these micro displacements, and it's a good example, I think, also because it has host community and IDPs. It was very quick intervention. People were under the trees. It was very much based on distributions, and it was very difficult to try to tackle like the traditional chiefs because everybody was basically running. But one of the things that really built up on the acceptance and the trust of the people were precisely their preference was, not surprisingly, like in many contexts, community assemblies. And what we were doing is sharing in those community assemblies the results of what we have here in terms of feedback. That was very much programmatic. We were not doing feedback on abuse. We were focusing on programmatic. Two excellent things. On one hand, the traditional chiefs felt full of pride because they had a very active role within this. And also the partner organization we were working with and the national staff were also went from absolute reluctance to seeing what's the added value of having this kind of systems. It was, at the end of the day, as simple as to say, we have had this number of complaints on these issues, and this is how we have dealt with them, and this is how, with these ones, we have to be humble and accept that, unfortunately, we don't have the way. And it was just very verbal, so the difficulty that we had was on traceability and documentation. And for that, one simple tool that I have been using as advisor from headquarters is when I know that these kind of cases happen, I do an exit interview / in-depth debriefing with key staff coming back from their missions. And we're trying to collect on all that rich tacit knowledge.
It's more or less similar to what Luis has just said. What we have in Darfur is a mandatory pre-distribution address. So for programmatic general issues, we make it a point that feedback is given during that pre-distribution address, which is mandatory. Before any distribution, there is that meeting where the beneficiaries are addressed, given the feedback, and also on the other general issues like the entitlements and everything like that is done. But on issues maybe like personal things, we channel them back through the CSD person, then they'll be given to the individual complainants, as it were. Right? We also have like some review meetings that we do, like this is now for the staff, where we meet with staff on a regular basis and also give them some feedback on the issues that are coming from the communities, so that they get to know what the communities are saying. So we do have like some fixed quarterly review meetings that we conduct for all staff, where we meet and say, today we are just discussing programmatic issues. And that's when we give feedback from our accountability system, our monitoring, and post-distribution monitoring, on-site monitoring, and all that kind of stuff. On listening to the host communities, our system is also like in the host communities. The IDP are within the host communities. And some of the host communities are also beneficiaries. Like we've got the seasonal support, where we are supporting these IDPs that are now part of the host communities. They came as IDP, but they're now fused into the host communities. Also have like some seasonal support. And during the distribution, we are given some seasonal support. The feedback mechanisms would be there, and they're able to also use the same system.
Perhaps very quick for Anders. The question about how aggregated information generated from feedback mechanism can be used at a higher level beyond programmatic, including, for instance, I'm looking at Anke and Doris from Germany. How does it percolate to their level, the level of strategic decision making in terms of informing program design or funding allocation? This is an area that we sense was going to be huge and a huge concern for the donors and senior decision makers, for instance, at the capital level. The problem that we had in trying to research and document this specific topic is that very often it is not documented, so we have an issue of traceability and documentation. So it was very hard for us to find cases that then we could go to the field and try to trace the decision-making process and the paper trail that accompanied that. But we came up during the field visit, we actually saw several examples where donors, this is for example a case in Pakistan, are quite active, some of them, in asking to be accompanying field staff in their visits, because they receive and they can access and they can ask for information coming from beneficiaries, including information generated through feedback mechanism. We have seen a good practice, for instance, this is also Pakistan, the interagency cluster coordination structure there, where some agencies decided and tried to have as a standing item in their agenda that when they report to their colleagues at their higher strategic level, which is what the ICC is trying to do, they always keep as a standing item summary of trend of feedback mechanism. But there is the main point I want to emphasize about strategic level use of feedback data. One thing across the board that we found out, it doesn't happen, change and decisions are not taken on the sole basis of data generated from feedback. We would be quite naive to think that single instances or even aggregated instances of data from aid recipients would be sufficient to trigger decision-making processes at the higher level. What happens, however, in the organization where there is better practice of information sharing and analysis, the decision maker, even those at the capital level and beyond, they would try to make sure that feedback from beneficiaries, from aid recipients, is included in what we call the evidence bundle, which is a stream of evidence that includes also information about, from monitoring data and quarterly reporting, to make sure that information from aid recipients enter in that evidence, in that set of evidence that is used by decision maker. And if you don't provide it, they would take decision on the basis of what else that is available, which is often not data that reflect voices from recipients.
And this particular example of the evidence bundle from World Vision Sudan, we're highlighting in the Sudan case study, which is in the back of the room. This milling voucher example that Lupati already talked about, so I won't review it again. This decision was not made solely on what arrived through the logbooks. When sufficient amount of feedback came up around these milling issues, the Khartoum senior management basically requested post-distribution monitoring data and an additional market analysis. So there's 3 points of data were used to make that program modification. So here's your evidence bundle in that particular case. On the question of communicating back, acknowledgement and also sharing, what are the changes being made, how long will it take, and so on. We've heard a number of different ways agencies are doing it, just haven't been able to profile all of them. Some really interesting ways. Suggestion boxes being opened publicly in a communal sort of way, where a community leader actually gets to keep a copy of what has been recorded through the suggestion box. Interesting issues there on confidentiality and anonymity if people don't trust their community leaders. So Haiti was an example where we heard that. In Haiti also, CRS is using this system where actually people get to keep a receipt. Their community liaison officers walk around all the time in the neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince with a little book. And when people come up to them and say, look, there's this issue and then this needs to be done, they write it out and the person gets to keep a receipt with a number. There's like a direct follow-up system. And then public meetings are used to report back out. So here's what's been resolved. It's going to take us 2 weeks to do this, and so on and so forth. Some people prefer public meetings. Not everybody can go to them. So in Pakistan's shelter cluster focal points, who are constantly on the ground in some of the most remote areas, are the other amplifying mechanism for what's being done by IOM and others in the cluster to communicate back on some of the significant changes or even some minor changes. But also IOM works through implementing partners. They rely very much on their implementing partners to be that communication, the mouthpiece for some of the ongoing changes that are being made to the program payments, structures, various decisions that they have made to adjust. I don't know if I answered.
So, I'm Doris Ernst with the German Foreign Office. So from the donor perspective, I have not seen any requests for adjustments in program based on feedback, but I would really appreciate it. Yeah. Because we only get requests only because of your pricing and your budget is different. But if you feel like something doesn't work and you get feedback, we would highly appreciate it. So.
Yes, very good. Great. Well, we have come to the end, I think more later than the end. Just want to thank, first of all, the panelists, and note, Luz was just saying, she has the action research in French, and you can email her. Her email's in the background, and there will be a translation in English. This is it's really, in one way, a very exciting area. There's a lot of work, a lot of experimentation. I think that the call for people to share what works, what doesn't, is really important, but not to lose sight of the fact that this is, I think, as you said, it's just one way that we can be engaging with people, and that the importance of presence, I think the importance of the fact that many times people actually say, if you're just doing your job really well, if you're really being participatory, if you're really out there in the communities, if you're present, we might not need these formal mechanisms, except for some of those more sensitive complaints. And the role of culture and context is really critical, and also that you are in, and I think that I'm glad that the panel really highlighted that it's not just about gathering feedback. We hear a lot of excitement about technology and all these great ways to collect feedback, but we really need to focus on how it's used. And whether, and again, how far up it goes. I think that there's actually a growing interest from a lot of donors, both in the humanitarian and the development field, in saying, you know, not just for programming, but actually this is about empowering people helping them to have their voices heard, not just in our programs, but really also with their governments and long-term in the development of their countries. So I just want to thank everyone and tell you to please keep listening and keep smiling.